in way geography.
As Colleen said, I'm the GIS election specialist at the Elections Commission. Can everyone see this? Does it look good? Okay. So anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about redistricting for elections. And so this goes into some of the topics that we've already talked about and already heard about from both LTSB and some of the other groups. But I wanted to talk specifically about the redistricting process for us at the Elections Commission. So there's kind of three main topics that I wanted to share. Hold on one second. And basically the first thing I want to do is I want to give you a preview of how the voter registration system works from kind of behind the scenes. Then I want to talk a little bit about how redistricting is going to affect that data, and then what happens after redistricting, and then finally some other kind of odds and ends about keeping election geographies up to date. So first of all, a little bit about Wisp Vote. So Wisp Vote used to be known as SVRS, so Statewide Voter Registration System. And then in 2016, we changed over to Wisp Vote. But we actually started using GIS in our systems in 2011. So that was right after, or actually right during the last redistricting period. So it contains voter information, which is connected to address records. Basically, as we've talked about in some of the other presentations, these are smallest, we're trying to get the smallest voting units so that we can get people the right ballots. And so we call those district combos. So it's using those wards that we've already talked about and then combining them with schools and then sanitary districts in some places to come up with that. And then finally, like I said, municipal and county clerks are assigning voters to a ballot style using this, and then also using a Google Maps API that we include in this process. So this is what Wisp Vote looks like from our homepage. If you've ever been in there, if you've ever noticed, ever seen it, if the clerks have ever showed you what's going on. So I usually deal with this address column. And this is what one of the addresses in our system looks like. So you can see on the left, you have kind of all the information about the address. But I wanted to point you to that district combo number. So in this case, it's the village of Elkhart Lake. And that first number refers to the municipality. Second number is the ward. Third number is the school district code. And then the final is if there is a sanitary split or if there are multiple school district splits. So as you can see on the right, that is the map that shows what that area is. So Ward 1 in the Elkhart Lake School District is kind of that left-hand side of Elkhart Lake. And so what does that mean? So that code then corresponds to all of the different districts that you would be voting for if you had that ballot. So if you're in Ward 1 and you're in that district combo, you're getting all of those elections kind of that you see on the bottom of the screen there. So you would be voting in all of those places. So then how does that affect election administration? So how does redistricting affect election administration? So when you were doing redistricting, basically what we're doing is we're swapping out all of those district combos because we have new wards, and then we have to replace them. And then we have to reassign all of those addresses based on those changes. So, you know, in some cases that will mean ballot styles will change a lot. In some cases they won't change that much, but it all depends on, as we saw earlier, if the clerks make massive changes to their maps. And then, you know, basically then what we do is we, like I said, swap out the data. So we're going to have to create new district combos based on the new ward data. And then once we get, again, combined with the school district data and the sanitary districts, once we get all of those together, then we can rematch the address. And the trick is going to be trying to review any issues that come up through that process. I haven't been through redistricting before, but I know that there are going to be issues with addresses getting placed incorrectly and things like that. So we'll just have to keep an eye out for those things. And I'll talk, I should mention a little bit that we're trying to do some of the address quality control work now to avoid those issues down the road. So I wanted to show you kind of what the ward data looks like currently in our system. And this is all based on the data that LTSB gives us. So the data that gets submitted every 6 months by the clerks, it looks kind of like this. And then once we overlay that with the wards in the school districts and the sanitary districts, you can see it already is getting more complicated. You're getting you're getting those different colors, and then if you see the dark colors, those are actually sanitary districts. And so then what we get is the district combos. So this is way more complicated than you saw with the ward data. You know, that's pretty clean. You can see kind of the municipal boundaries, but then once you start getting into school districts, it gets much more complicated. And then here's an example of showing all of those addresses kind of overlaid on top of one of those district combos. So any address that falls in those areas is going to get assigned to that district combo. So then I wanted to talk a little bit about what happens after redistricting, because that's really where we come into play. Redistricting, for the most part, is out of our hands at the Elections Commission. We're implementing what gets passed by the legislature. But the ward updates between the redistricting periods is where a lot of the work kind of comes in. So every 6 months, according to statute, the counties have to submit data to the to the state in order to get the kind of handle the annexations that happen. So we have to then update our maps before every election to kind of make those changes. And then what we try to do is we also try to run a comparison between the current version and the old version in order to find those areas that have changed. And sometimes if there is a annexation that happens a week or two before an election, we have to make manual changes to make sure that those voters get kind of assigned to the right spot before they go to the polling place. So I wanted to address this issue specifically because we get a lot of questions from clerks and from GIS people about when they should be creating new wards or what causes a new ward to get created. So basically, when an annexation occurs, land can either get combined with an existing ward or a new ward has to be created. So we looked at all those different districts that the wards included, but really the main four that we kind of look at when we're checking for this is whether it crosses congressional, assembly, or Senate lines, or county supervisor lines. So in the cases of congressional, assembly, and Senate lines, there really isn't any room in statute for exceptions to that rule. So if you have an annexation that crosses those lines, it needs to be a new ward. And then, you know, basically it will stay a new ward until the next redistricting period when those lines can get changed. In the case of county supervisor lines, there actually is a special carve out in statute that allows those county supervisor lines to get moved, but there is also a specific process that has to happen. So basically with county supervisor lines, it would still be a new ward unless the county board takes action on those things. And there is a special section that actually says that those can only be moved once a year. So it creates a kind of a weird situation that we haven't quite resolved as far as what happens between those dates. But basically those actions need to be through kind of a county board. So, and then I also, as we've talked about before, we also want to be aware of the contiguity rule. So wards have to be contiguous unless they contain those true islands, which is areas surrounded entirely by township land. So I'll just give you kind of an example of what this looks like when we're reviewing this data. So Here you can see Eau Claire. This is actually the part of Eau Claire, city of Eau Claire that's in Chippewa County. There were 2 new annexations that have happened recently. And those areas, you can see the red line is the assembly lines. Those areas cross those assembly lines. So in these 2 cases, that means that they have to be new wards, because there's no other city of Eau Claire wards that kind of have that particular district combination. But you can also see that Ward 78 on the right-hand side and Ward 82 don't touch each other. So even though all of their district information matches, those need to be separate wards because they're not kind of the true islands, as we talked about. And then here's another example of one that just kind of a boundary agreement that just occurred. So the area to the left there, Appleton Ward 63, that had to be a new ward, even though the area just to the right of it, that's in Ward 59, is very close to touching it, but it's not touching it. And so even though Wards 59 and 63 have the same district information, they're not adjacent to each other. So therefore they need to be separate wards. So, and then Ward 59, actually there was a piece, the piece to the right, kind of that long snaking piece, that was an area that was brought into the city, but because it was adjacent to Ward 59, it could get included there. So you kind of just, and I should be clear, like you could create a new ward in those cases, even though you don't need to. And so usually, you know, clerks don't want to create new wards if they don't have to, but you could create a new ward anytime an annexation happens. It's really up to the municipality. And then I wanted to just point out kind of a strange one. So Village of Dousman has an area that just got annexed in pretty recently on the left there, that Ward 5. That one is actually not surrounded, not touching the existing village. So I guess that would be the true island situation. And so you could combine that with the existing ward. It kind of creates this weird mess, I would say. But they are all, you know, the assembly districts all match, so everything kind of matches up there. So basically what I do then is when this data comes through, I have to match the spatial data up with what the clerks are telling me. So in a lot of cases, the clerks will tell me, hey, this should be a new ward, or usually it's they don't think it should be a new ward, and then I have to tell them, unfortunately, it crosses one of these lines and you have to create a new ward. And so they then have to go back through that process, and then I have to work with the county GIS or with LTSB. It depends on what the situation is, and kind of get those issues fixed. But usually my main point of contact is the DOA's annexation page. So I don't know if I have a picture here in a second, but basically that is where I will get a lot of my information. We like when clerks send us annexations. So they're supposed to send us, when an annexation happens, they're supposed to send that data to DOA, but then they're also supposed to send it to us so that we can get any voters kind of fixed as part of that process. But that doesn't always happen. And so I usually have to be tracking down some of this information from them. And I think that's where DOA's information comes in handy. So if you've ever seen this page, this is where all of their annexations kind of get logged. And I kind of use this to go and review those annexations. So, and I just wanted to point out kind of a couple of things here, just showing, we talked about the census block geography before, and how hopefully that will be better this upcoming election. But I just wanted to give you a preview of what bad geography can cause to happen when it comes to elections. So you can see here in the town of Norway, there's a line there that's kind of going through the middle of parcels. And so this, from a 30,000 foot scale doesn't seem to, probably be noticeable, but when you're actually running elections off this stuff, you need to be very careful when this happens, and you have to kind of work around it. So here's an example of one of those addresses where this is a problem. So you can see on the right there, the address pin is actually really, really close to that line. And if we go back, you can see, okay, well, that line was actually going through the middle of that parcel. So then the question is, okay, well, which side of the line should that be on? So you can see here, I just zoomed in on the satellite view, and you're kind of guessing at which part of that house should, where should the voters be going, basically. And so the statutes just say that it's, you should be voting where you live. And so that kind of is up to interpretation to some extent. But you can see how these geographies can cause problems if they're not matching up to those parcel lines. And so that's why it's really, really important that when you're doing this mapping, that you kind of match to those parcel lines, and you're matching up to the boundaries of the municipalities. And then I also just wanted to point out what can happen if the address points aren't in the right spot. So here's an example, and you can see in some of these cases, those address pins are in the middle of the road. And by having that, it may not cause an issue for this election. So like if the pin's in the road, but that's not a boundary line, it's not going to cause any problems for now. But let's say in redistricting that one of those roads then became the boundary line. You could see then you'd have a bunch of addresses that you wouldn't really know which side of the line they're supposed to be on. So one of the focuses for us this summer is to encourage clerks to fix some of these addresses, but we're also trying to do some of that work for them so that we are able to kind of fix those addresses using GIS and using geocoding to make this not as big of a problem once we get the new maps. So as I mentioned, future improvements, there are gaps and overlaps between the wards and the school districts and the sanitary districts, which cause problems. And so we're trying to get those kind of situations fixed, which a lot of times relies on going to the sources of those data and trying to get those fixed. And then again, any differences between the census wards and the parcel boundaries, that's kind of stuff that we want to get corrected. I think as Ryan mentioned, it's kind of late in the process to get the blocks fixed, but hopefully we've done enough legwork now that the 2020 data is much improved on that end. And then again, integrating the ward shape files directly instead of me having to review those every time. But that also relies on clerks and GIS folks to, have all of those annexations and have them coded correctly. And then finally, as I'm sure a lot of people are waiting for, the statewide address point layer is going to be hugely beneficial to us if we can get that. So, right now we're relying on commercial geocoding for the most part. We get data directly from the cities, the villages in some cases for new addresses, new subdivisions, apartments, things like that. But if we had a kind of definitive address point layer that we could use, then we wouldn't really run into those same problems. So that's kind of the goals for moving forward, but hopefully many of these things can be addressed during redistricting, and then we can kind of go forward from there. So that's all I had, but I will be happy to take any questions that anyone has.
I loved seeing the banter and the feeling of community in the chat box. Nothing specific to me stood out as a question for you, Greg, more of shared experience and a little misery, shared misery too.